Reconstructing Blame. William Lloyd Garrison decided to stay home and witness the magnificent 2-hour procession of dignitaries, especially the veterans of the 54th and 55th Massachusetts regiments. When Garrison stepped to the podium at Faneuil Hall at the close of the celebration of the passage of the 15th Amendment, he looked older than his 64 years, tired and ready to step fully out of the public life. He regarded the 15th Amendment as a miracle. The members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, meanwhile, felt that their work was finished. They officially disbanded on April 9, 1870. The 15th Amendment confers upon the African race the care of its own destiny. It places their fortunes in their own hands, imagined Ohio Congressman James A. Garfield. An Illinois newspaper proclaimed, "The Negro is now a voter and a citizen. Let him hereafter take his chances in the battle of life." The passage of the 15th Amendment caused Republicans to turn their backs on the struggle against racial discrimination. After refusing to distribute land and giving landless blacks the ability to choose their own masters and calling that freedom, after handing poor blacks an equal rights statement they could use in the expense of courts and calling that equality, they put the ballot in the black man's hand and called that security. "The ballot is the citadel of the colored man's safety," parodied one black Southerner. "The guarantor of his liberty, it's the protector of his rights, the defender of his immunities and privileges, the savior of his fruits of his toil, the weapon of offense and defense, his peacemaker, his nemesis that watches and guards over him with sleepless eye by day and by night." As this black Southerner knew so well, the ballot never did stop all those hooded night riders. Klan violence was needed to, quote, "keep the niggers in their place," unquote, explained Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Klan's first honorary Grand Wizard. To the Klan, the only thing worse than a Negro was a white radical, but the worst offender was a suspected black rapist of a white woman. Klansmen glorified white womanhood as the epitome of honor and purity and asexuality, and demeaned black womanhood as the epitome of immorality and filth and sex. Some black men demeaned black women too. "Lord Sar," said prosperous black Kansan, "you not think I marry a black nigger wench." Klansmen religiously believed that blacks possessed supernatural sexual powers, and this belief fueled their sexual attraction to black women and their fear of white women being attracted to black men. It became almost standard operating procedure to justify Klan terrorism by maintaining that Southern white supremacy was necessary to defend the purity of white women. Black women's bodies, in contrast, were regarded as a training ground for white men or a stabilizing safety valve for white men's sexual energies that allowed the certain veneration of the asexual pureness of white womanhood to continue. The other threat to white male dominance was upwardly mobile black people. Klan terrorism showed the charade that was always the strategy of uplift suasion. Again, uplift suasion is the idea that if you show whites that there's some really upstanding black citizens, they'll understand that racism is wrong. This author is arguing, Kendi argues, that uplift suasion never will work. And in fact, the more uplifted and civilized, quote-unquote, the black people were, the angrier the whites were with them. Going back to the reading. "The Klan did not like to see the Negro go ahead," reported a white Mississippian. "Landless blacks were terrorized by landowners. Land-owning blacks were terrorized by the Klan." In March 1870, President Grant sent to Congress documentary evidence of more than 5,000 cases of white terrorism. Between May 1870 and April 1871, Congress passed 3 poorly funded enforcement acts that dispatched election supervisors to the South, criminalized interference with black voting, and turned a wide range of Klan-type terrorism acts into federal offenses. I believe your book and the video you watch calls this the Force Act. Same thing. As a result, the Klan had nominally dissolved by 1871, but the train of terror still rushed down the tracks under new names. It became clear to all, as a Northern transplant explained, that only steady, unswerving power from without could guarantee peace and the survival of Southern republicanism. A steady, unswerving black power from within could have done so too, but Republicans remained unwilling to fortify blacks with Buffalo soldiers and land. The vote was supposed to make miracles, and in some ways it did. Southern constitutional conventions from 1876 to 1869 were a revolutionary sight to behold. They included Northern transplants, Southern Republicans, and Southern black delegates, about half of whom had been born into slavery. For all their lack of political experience, wealth, or schooling, or rather because of it, these delegates produced alluringly democratic constitutions. They instituted the South's first publicly funded education systems, penitentiaries, orphanages, and insane asylums, expanded women's rights, and guaranteed black rights, reduced the number of crimes, and reorganized local governments to eliminate dictatorships. Initially, however, black politicians usually stepped aside when the positions of power were divided up because they did not want to lend credibility to persistent Democratic charges of, quote, black supremacy, as if the charge had some logic to it. That's pretty crucial. While blacks rarely benefited from Reconstruction's economic policies, growing corporations did. Facing war-torn communities and treasuries, the same Reconstruction politicians who refused to hand out land and aid to landless blacks on the pretext that it would ruin them, handed millions out to railroad companies on the pretext that railroads would develop the South by bringing new jobs, factories, and towns, allowing for transport of untapped minerals, and extend agriculture. By 1872, most of the South only had debt and poverty to show for the incredible amounts of welfare handed out to railroad corporations. Bribed politicians happily gave away these funds. Only a small number of black politicians sat in senior positions of power, and thus their share of the corruption, paled in comparison to that of the white politicians. A quick point, in the American Pageant, Chapter 23, this will be covered in the Gilded Age and the corruption of the Gilded Age. Same time period. Every dollar taken from the Southern treasuries heightened Southern reliance on cheap labor. President Grant figured that maybe if blacks had somewhere else to go, planters would value black labor more. Actually, planters did value cheap labor, and they used their guns and racist ideas to keep black labor as cheap as possible. In early 1870, Grant began a presidential push for the annexation of the Dominican Republic to provide a haven for the entire colored population of the United States, should it choose to emigrate. He sent Frederick Douglass on a fact-finding mission in 1871. The DR, the Dominican Republic, could not only become a black haven, the impressed Douglass reported, but by transplanting within her tropical borders the glorious institutions of the United States, the blacks who moved there could uplift the impoverished and backward Dominican people. Douglass seemed unaware that he was recycling against Dominicans the very same racist ideas that had been used against African Americans. And if the U.S. institutions were so glorious, then why did African Americans need a foreign haven? Assimilationists like Douglass encouraged American expansion, while segregationists and anti-racists discouraged it, bringing the ongoing racial dispute into foreign policy. Again, assimilationists are those who want to bring African Americans kind of into the white culture. Anti-racists are those who feel that African Americans and all races are good on their own, and segregationists, of course, want to separate them. The U.S. Senate voted down the annexation treaty in June 1871. Tired of Grant's preoccupation with annexation and his openness to using federal power to protect Southern black lives, Republican dissidents broke away. In May 1872, New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley and Illinois Senator Lyman Trumbull, central forces in the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, headlined an assembly of liberal Republicans in Cincinnati. "Reconstruction and slavery we have done with," declared E.L. Godkin, the editor of The Nation, speaking for the liberal Republicans. They pledged amnesty and voting rights for ex-Confederates and the end of federal Southern intervention, welfare for the rich in the form of tax breaks, and nothing for the poor. Quick pause here. So you have the Republican Party now splitting in the 1870s into liberal Republicans that want to end Reconstruction, we're done, let's go home, and Republicans who want to maintain Reconstruction in the South and troops in the South. Greeley, the liberal Republican, emerged as their presidential candidate. The arch-enemy of the Confederacy became the arch-friend of the Confederacy, similar to the nation's most famous preacher, whom Frederick Douglass sarcastically called the Apostle of Forgiveness. Seeking to reunite white Northerners and Southerners through Christian whiteness, Henry Ward Beecher published the first American biography of Jesus, The Life of Jesus the Christ, in 1871. "There is absolutely nothing to determine the personal appearance of Jesus," wrote Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, yet Beecher included in the book 5 depictions of the perfect God-man named Jesus, and they all depicted a white man. Henry Ward Beecher gave white Americans a model for embedding whiteness into the religious worldviews of Jesus Christ, without ever saying so out loud, just as Southern and Northern whites were doing with their political worldviews. It went without saying for racists that white people were the best equipped to rule the United States under the heavenly guidance of the white Father and Son. Horace Greeley had long been associated with emancipation and equality, but he made himself over in order to campaign as the Democratic candidate for president in 1872. "Political equality is far off," he lectured blacks. "Social equality will remain forever out of reach. Don't expect free gifts of land. Segregate yourselves. Employ each other. Who are your best friends? Sound, conservative, knowing white Southerners." These knowing white Southerners made it known to black people, as one South Carolinian observed, that to vote against the wishes of their white employers and neighbors was to risk death. Congress issued a report in the spring of 1872 condemning Southern violence, but it only went so far. The report even adopted the segregationist position, arguing that blacks were the cause. The violence, the report explained, was a response to the bad legislation, official incompetency, and corruption of black politicians. It hardly mattered that Southern white politicians sat in the overwhelming majority of the powerful and corruptible positions. The truth hardly mattered to the producers of these racist ideas, who were seeking to defend the racist policies of buckling black political power. Grant's former Secretary of the Interior, Jacob Cox, said Southerners could only be governed through the part of the community that embodies the intelligence and the capital. The Nation put it more bluntly. Reconstruction had totally failed. Enough blacks and Republican whites risked death to win the most of the South and President Grant's re-election in 1872. On Southern streets, armed Republicans had to defend their re-elected politicians. In Colfax, Louisiana, this is known as the Colfax Massacre, in Colfax, Louisiana, 61 armed blacks barricaded themselves inside a courthouse on Easter Sunday, 1873. Democrats shelled the courthouse with artillery, snatched out of the 37 survivors, and executed them in the town square. The day after the Colfax Massacre, the U.S. Supreme Court, including Grant's 4 corporate lawyer appointees, massacred the civil rights protections of the 14th Amendment in the slaughterhouse cases. This is a fairly famous series of court cases. White New Orleans butchers felt their economic privileges and immunities were being denied by the bribe-instigated 1869 Louisiana statute requiring them to do business at the slaughterhouse company. Writing for the majority, Justice Samuel Miller upheld the monopoly on April 14, 1873, distinguishing between national and state citizenship, and citing Roger B. Taney's Dred Scott opinion. The 14th Amendment only protected the relatively few rights of national citizens, Miller stated. 3 years later, this doctrine split between the national and state citizenship allowed a unanimous Supreme Court to reverse the convictions of the perpetrators of the Colfax Massacre. Murder prosecution, quote, rests alone with the states, thus giving Louisiana the freedom to exonerate them, to, acquit and exonerate the people who slaughtered all the African Americans at the courthouse. The court also voided the Enforcement Acts and encouraged white terrorist organization just in time for the election of 1876. None of the 4 slaughterhouse dissenters objected to the most far-reaching part of Justice Miller's majority opinion. We doubt very much whether any action of a state, not directed by way of discrimination against the Negroes as a class or on account of their race, will ever come within the purview of this provision. To this day, the Supreme Court still uses Miller's doctrine to shield private and race-veiled discriminators, those who veil policies intended to discriminate against black people by not using racial language. Neither ex-Confederates voting again nor the slaughterhouse ruling could compare to the destructive force of the Panic of 1873. It was the first major economic depression of American industrial capitalism and lasted the rest of the decade. Southern Democrats declared their ability to restore order, just as the oil man John D. Rockefeller and the steel man Andrew Carnegie declared their ability to monitor their industries. By the end of the century, the Rockefeller and Carnegie monopolies reflected the white political monopolies steering the South. As the poorest of the poor, Southern blacks were the most devastated of the devastated by the Panic of 1873. The Panic halted the modest post-war ascent of black landowners, snatching their land and their freedom. When legions of small white landowners lost their land too, they felt as if they were losing their whiteness and freedom. Whites must have small plots of land, one planter complained, and prefer tending them, poor as they may be in return, to lowering themselves to think as they think of it by working for another. Holding out hope for redistributed land as long as they could, rural Southern blacks walked backward into sharecropping, meaning they handed the landowner a share of the crop as payment for their ability to farm there. Crooked landowners maneuvered sharecroppers into debt, and laws prevented sharecroppers from leaving landowners to whom they owed money. Blacks who were able to leave a bad situation took to the road, looking endlessly for ethical landowners. Landowners called this annual movement a sign of black shiftlessness. Stuck between racist policies and ideas, sharecroppers could not win. Staying often meant servitude, but leaving meant shiftlessness. Nothing seemed to dent racist ideas, not even upwardly mobile urban blacks. In 1874, Nashville's white-owned Republican banner praised the thrifty and cleanly blacks, but they could not be taken as representative of the indolent and shiftless hundreds of thousands, the banner opined. They were extraordinary. By early 1870s, Given the snatching away from the black civil rights, William Lloyd Garrison had no choice but to make his voice heard once again. He ridiculed the abandonment of Reconstruction in essay after essay in The Independent, and an open letter after open letter in the Boston Journal. Vice President Henry Wilson complained to Garrison of a counter-revolution overtaking Reconstruction. Our anti-slavery veterans must again speak out, Wilson urged. Some failed to speak out because they were too busy blaming black people for their failures of Reconstruction. And how could they not? Northern press reports regularly depicted black voters and politicians as self-destructively stupid and corrupt. The Associated Press relied on anti-black, anti-Reconstruction Southern papers for daily dispatches. New York Tribune reporter James S. Pike blanketed Northerners with racist fairy tales of corrupt, incompetent, lazy black politicians who conquered and deprived white South Carolinians during the tragedy of Reconstruction. These claims were published in his widely circulated newspaper articles in 1873, republished as the Prostrate State, South Carolina under Negro government, in 1874. Pike's Democratic sources were happy to blame the Southern corruption on black people, as it diverted attention from their principal role in the corruption. Pike's well-written novel passed as eyewitness journalism. In the place of this old aristocratic society stands the rude form of the most ignorant democracy that mankind ever saw, Pike wrote. It is barbarism, overwhelming civilization, and the slave rioting in the halls of his master and putting that master under his feet. The prostrate state caused pro-Reconstruction periodicals, Scribner's, Harper's, The Nation, and The Atlantic Monthly, to pummel black legislators even more and demand a national reunion of white rule. A New York Democrat read from the prostrate state on the House floor. "Where's your book on New York corruption?" asked the black South Carolina Congressman Robert Small. Though the bribers and the bribed knew corruption was a national affair, primarily among white politicians, racist ideas never did quite subscribe to the magazine of reality. Black corruption was a ready-made excuse to abandon the increasingly difficult, expensive, disordering, and divisive Reconstruction policies. Every time Grant administration intervened to protect black lives, he alienated Northern and Southern whites from the Republican Party. During the 1874 midterm elections, Democrats knocked Republicans out of control of the House of Representatives and out of power in every Southern state except Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. So Republicans are losing some power here. White terrorist organizations warred with armed and unarmed black voters across the South. President Grant had to send troops to prevent an army of 3,500 Democrats from forcing out elected Republicans in New Orleans in 1874. Wendell Phillips was jeered off at a Boston stage for trying to defend Grant. The New York Times reported that Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison are not exactly extinct from American politics, but they represent ideas in regard to the South which the majority of the Republican Party have outgrown. Just to stop here for a second, the lesson that many Republicans learned was that to defend blacks too much and to use too much force and expense to protect them alienates white voters, and they lost the House of Representatives. The final bill of radical Reconstruction was pushed through Congress in early 1875, before the New Democrats took office. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was a legislative memorial to Senator Charles Sumner, who died in 1874 after decades in the anti-slavery and civil rights trenches. The bill outlawed racial discrimination in jury selection, public transportation, and public accommodations, but it required blacks to seek redress in the expensive and hostile courts. The bill hardly stopped the terror campaign against Mississippi's black voters that allowed Democrats to gain state control in the fall of 1875 election. Mississippi's embattled Republican governor, Adelbert Ames, declared that a revolution is taking place by force of arms, and a race are disenfranchised. They are to be returned to a condition of serfdom in an era of second slavery. A Southern newspaper declared that the 14th and 15th Amendments may stand forever, but we intend to make them dead letters. With Reconstruction of Southern democracy on life support, the United States celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. From May to November 1876, roughly one-fifth of the U.S. population attended the first of the official World Fairs, Philadelphia's Centennial Exposition. A band of old-time plantation darkies singing songs at the Southern Restaurant was the only display depicting black people. In Boston, William Lloyd Garrison gave an Independence Day address for the ages. The shift in public opinion away from Reconstruction was the consequence of emancipating black people as a military necessity rather than as an act of general repentance, he said. In his last major public speech, Garrison recognized racist ideas as the core of the problem. "We must give up the spirit of complexional caste," Garrison declared, "or give up Christianity." In Hamburg, South Carolina, the local black militia celebrated the 4th of July centennial with a parade. Area racists hated the militia for maintaining blacks' ability to control the majority black town. During the parade, harsh words were exchanged when a local white farmer ordered militia members to move aside for his carriage. The farmer appealed to former Confederate General Matthew C. Butler, the area's most powerful Democrat. On July 8th, Butler and a small posse ordered the militia head, Union Army veteran Doc Adams, to disarm the Hamburg militia. Adams refused, and fighting broke out. The militiamen retreated to their armory. Butler dashed off for nearby Augusta, but returned with hundreds of reinforcements and cannon. Butler's contingent executed 5 militiamen and looted and destroyed the undefended homes and shops of Hamburg, again the majority black town. When Southerners complained of their lost cause, an appalled President Grant realized that they were complaining of their lost freedom to, quote, kill Negroes and Republicans without fear of punishment and without loss of caste or reputations. General Butler made a mockery of the congressional investigation, capitalizing on the attention by being elected to the U.S. Senate in 1877. He blamed the massacre on innate black criminality. Blacks, he said, possessed little regard for human life. General Butler was invoking blacks' natural proclivity for violence and criminality to avoid punishment for the massacre he had carried out. But hardly any congressional investigators questioned his motive for expressing these racist ideas, which at the time were being codified by a prison doctor in Italy, Cesare Lombroso, proved in 1876 that non-white men love to kill, mutilate the corpse, tear its flesh, and drink its blood. His Criminal Man gave birth to the discipline of criminology in 1876. Criminals were born, not bred, Lombroso said. He believed that born criminals emitted physical signs that could be studied, measured, and quantified, and that the inability to blush, and therefore dark skin, had always been considered the accompaniment of crime. Black women, in their close degree of differentiation from the male, he claimed, in the female offender in 1895, were the prototypical female criminals. As white terrorists brutalized, raped, and killed people in communities around the black world, the first crop of Western criminologists were intent on giving criminals a black face and the well-behaved citizen a white face. Lombroso's student, Italian law professor Raffaele Garofalo, invented the term criminology, criminologia, in 1885. British physician Havelock Ellis popularized Lombroso in the English-speaking world, publishing a compendium of his writings in 1890. The Hamburg perpetrators kept shouting, "This is the beginning of the redemption of the South." Redemption's a big term. Remember the Redeemers and Redemption. These are white people trying to bring back the South for the white people. Redemption of the South. Indeed it was. When the election of 1876 came in November, it was war at the polls, and Democrats stuffed ballot boxes across the South. By the morning of November 1876, Democrat New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden and Republican Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes were virtually tied in the Electoral College. The presidential election's outcome rested in the contested election returns of Louisiana and South Carolina. When a 15-member electoral commission handed Republicans the presidency, Democrats were outraged. In early 1877, both parties and both regions began planning for another civil war. The parties and regions remained united on one issue. Blacks must quell their new-kindled ambition and recognize their lack of whites' hereditary faculty of self-government, said former Ohio Governor Jacob D. Cox. Outgoing President Grant privately told his cabinet that giving black men the ballot had been a mistake, and so did Republican presidential hopeful Rutherford B. Hayes. While a consensus formed on who should govern the South, division intensified over who should govern in Washington, D.C. The nation on the brink, Hayes' representatives met with Democrats at the Wormley House, a hotel owned by the capital's richest African American. No one ever revealed the exact terms of the bargain of 1877, but Democrats handed Republican Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency, while Hayes ended Reconstruction for the Democrats. He recognized the stolen Democratic governments in Louisiana and South Carolina. He withdrew federal troops from the South and used those troops to crush the Great Strike of 1877. As capital regained control of labor, the Knights of Labor materialized as the principal national labor organization. Knights head Terence V. Powderly demanded unions' desegregation to control the competition. He considered blacks as a lazy reservoir of cheap labor that could easily be used against white labor. Just to pause real quick, this is also known in the AP book as the Compromise of 1877. Republicans, they get the presidency, and in return to the Democrats, they pull out troops from the South so the South can do what it was been doing before the Civil War. Very bad for African Americans. The Nation, the magazine The Nation, made the bargain of 1877 plain. The time had come for the Negro to disappear from the field of national politics, said the news magazine. Henceforth, the nation, as a nation, will have nothing more to do with him. Meanwhile, William Lloyd Garrison labeled the bargain an abomination amounting to the old covenant with death. When troops departed Shreveport, Louisiana, a black man grieved about his people being back in the hands of the very men that held them as slaves, so that there was no way on earth they could better their condition. Not one single right enjoyed by the colored people shall be taken from them, pledged the new Democratic South Carolina Governor, Wade Hampton. As the Negro becomes more intelligent, Hampton added, he naturally allies himself with the more conservative whites, for his observation and experience both show him that his interests are identified with those of the white race here. Hampton opened two doors for blacks in post-Reconstruction South Carolina: naturally submissive intelligence or naturally rebellious stupidity. The Reconstruction era, the dozen or so years followed the end of the Civil War in 1865, had been a horrific time for Southern white men like Wade Hampton, who were used to ruling their black people and their women. They faced and beat back with violence and violent ideas a withering civil rights and black empowerment movement, as well as a powerful women's movement that failed to grab as many headlines. But their supposed underlings did not stop rebelling after the fall of Reconstruction. To intimidate and reassert their control over rebellious blacks and white women, white male redeemers took up lynching in the 1880s. Someone was lynched, on average, every 4 days from 1889 to 1929, often justifying the ritualistic slaughters on a false rumor that the victim had raped a white woman. White men, women, and children gathered to watch the torture, killing, and dismemberment of human beings, all the while calling the victims savages. Hate fueled the lynching era. But behind this hatred lay racist ideas that evolved to question black freedoms at every stage. And behind these racist ideas were powerful white men striving by word and deed to regain absolute political, economic, and cultural control of the South. Southern black people felt a range of emotions as they trekked from slavery to war to emancipation to radical Reconstruction to black redemption to white redemption. Their feelings might seem to resemble the range of emotions a parent might feel living through the exciting birth, hopeful growth, and tragic death of a beloved child. Some blacks, angry over Reconstruction's demise, felt the need to run away from their second slavery. It is impossible for us to live with these slaveholders in the South, said one Louisiana organizer representing more than 60,000 hard-laboring people eager to flee the South. Resettlement to Africa or the North or far west was not nearly as popular in the late 1870s as the exodus to Kansas. The exodusters ignored the opposition of Frederick Douglass and increased Kansas's black population by 150%. Northern allies did all they could to fundraise exodusters. William Lloyd Garrison, at 74 years old, exhausted himself raising money for hundreds of black exodusters fleeing the Mississippi and Louisiana. On April 24, 1879, Garrison had hoped to address a rally for the exodusters at Boston's Faneuil Hall, but he was too weak to attend. Still, he made sure his voice was heard, sending a reverberating statement. Let the edict go forth, trumpet-tongued, that there shall be a speedy end put to all this bloody misrule, that the millions of loyal colored citizens at the South, now under ban and virtually disenfranchised, shall be put in the safe enjoyment of their rights, shall freely vote and be fairly represented, just where they are located. And let the rallying cry be heard from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast, liberty and equal rights for each, for all, and forever, wherever the lot of man is cast without our abroad domains. He had hoped for immediate emancipation when all hope had been lost. He now hoped for immediate equality when all hope had been lost. The thrilling statement of hope on April 24, 1879, proved to be the last will and testament of William Lloyd Garrison. 4 weeks later, he was dead.